How did the most feared people in Europe end up living in the most peaceful corner of the world? Because in the year 793, that reputation was earned in a single morning. Ships with dragon heads ground onto the beach of a holy island called Lindisfarne, and men with axes walked into a monastery that had never needed a wall. A scholar wrote to the King of Northumbria afterwards, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain. The Viking age starts here, on this beach, at this little priory. And here is the first thing the map gets wrong about these people. We say the Vikings came from Norway, Sweden and Denmark. But look at their homeland in 793. There is no Norway, there is no Sweden, there is no Denmark. Not one of those countries exists yet, just a coastline of chiefdoms, feuds and fjords. This video is the story of how that became three of the most stable countries on Earth. And the story includes an empire that owned England, a bloodbath at a coronation, a king who died to a ski race, and a divorce settled by the largest landslide in the history of voting. Stay to the end because the final number is absurd. First, why did they even leave? Because the land made them. A wall of mountains splits the peninsula. On the west side, farmland exists only in scraps between cliff and water. When a farm can feed one son and a family raises four, 3 sons need a boat. The sea was not their barrier, it was their motorway. So for 2 centuries, the north poured out. West to Ireland, where they founded Dublin as a trading post. South to Francia, where a warlord named Rollo was handed a whole province just to make the raiding stop. You know it today by the name it took from the Northmen. Normandy, east down the rivers of Russia all the way to Constantinople, where the emperor hired Norsemen as his personal bodyguard. England tried a different strategy, paying them to leave. One payment alone came to £48,000 of silver. It worked so badly that the fleet simply came back for the next installment, and today archaeologists find more Anglo-Saxon silver in Scandinavia than in England itself. And when there was nothing left to raid in one direction, they sailed into the empty ocean. Iceland in 874, Greenland after that, and around the year 1000, a coastline they called Vinland. North America, 5 centuries before Columbus, from people whose homeland still was not a country. They left something else behind too. Every time you say window or knife or husband or Thursday, Thorsday, you are speaking a little Old Norse. The raiders are hiding in your own sentences. And not all of it was violence, which is the part the raids overshadow. At Hedeby in the south and Birka in the east, the north built proper boomtowns, where Arab silver, Rhineland swords and furs from the deep forests changed hands in the same street. An Arab traveller who visited Hedeby described the singing as the growling of dogs, only worse. Rude. But he was describing a trading city, not a pirate camp. The money that would build the kingdoms was already flowing. But that is what they did to everyone else. The real question is what happened back home. And back home, the fighting was about to turn inward. Tradition says it happened in a sea battle at Hafrsfjord in roughly 872, when a king with a famous haircut, Harald Fairhair, beat the coastal chiefs and unified Norway. The truth is messier. The date was calculated 1,000 years afterwards, and historians now suspect the unification took generations. But watch what the legend does on the map. For the first time, one colour runs along that coast. The idea of Norway is born, even if the paperwork comes later. Denmark's founding moment is carved in stone, and you can still visit it. At Jelling, King Harald Bluetooth raised a rune stone boasting that he had won all Denmark and Norway, and made the Danes Christian. Danes call it the country's birth certificate. It is a rock doing the job of a founding document, and yes, that Harald. 1,000 years later, engineers wanted a name for a technology that unites devices the way he united Denmark. The Bluetooth logo on your phone is his initials, written in runes. You carry a Viking king's monogram in your pocket. Sweden came last, and Sweden came strangest. While its neighbours took the cross, the Swedes kept sacrificing at the great pagan temple of Uppsala. A German churchman described it within living memory. Gold-decked, ringed with offering trees. 2 peoples, the Svea and the Götar, took centuries more to fuse into one crown. Remember that lateness, Sweden, being the youngest brother, is going to matter for the next 500 years. So by the year 1000, 3 young kingdoms, 1 old habit. And the habit was England. What happens next is the part almost nobody remembers. For 20 years, England was Scandinavia. In 1016, the Danish king's son, Canute, took the English crown outright, then Denmark's, then Norway's. 1 king, 1 sea, 3 crowns. On this map, his empire looks impossible, a country whose main road is open ocean. For 2 decades it worked: English silver, Danish soldiers, Norwegian coastline. And then Canute died, and it fell apart faster than it was built, because it was never a country, it was one extraordinary man's network. Which brings us to the most famous year on any map, 1066, and everyone remembers the wrong battle. Before Hastings, there was a Viking ending. Harald Hardrada of Norway, the last great Norse warlord, a man who had fought from Norway to Constantinople, landed in the north of England with 300 ships to take the whole island. One final time, the English king Harold Godwinson force-marched his army about 185 miles in around a week and caught the Norse with their armour off. The chronicle says the bridge itself was held by a single giant with an axe, cutting down man after man until a spearman drifted under the bridge in a barrel and thrust up through the planks. However true that is, what is certain is that Hardrada took an arrow to the throat, and the Viking age died with him at a bridge in Yorkshire. 19 days later, exhausted from that very battle and the march back south, Harold's army met another invader at Hastings, William of Normandy, great-great-great-grandson of Rollo the Viking. Read that again. The army that ended the Viking age was destroyed 3 weeks later by the Vikings' own descendants. The North lost England, and the North's grandchildren took it anyway. Home from the raids, the 3 kingdoms did something unexpected. They calmed down. Churches replaced war fleets. Over the grave of Norway's warrior saint, Olaf rose Nidaros Cathedral, the northernmost great cathedral on earth, and pilgrims walked to the top of the world to see it. For 2 centuries, the map you are watching barely moves. Do not trust it. The next thing to hit this peninsula kills more people than every Viking raid combined. In 1349, a ship from England drifted into Bergen with a dead crew and a live cargo of rats. The Black Death took perhaps half of Norway, maybe more. Whole valleys went silent, and it did something no army had managed. It beheaded the kingdom. Norway's nobles, priests, and administrators died in such numbers that the country lost the class of people who run a state. Norway survived the plague. Norwegian independence, for the next 500 years, did not. Denmark, meanwhile, acquired the oldest national flag still in use, and the story is fully absurd. Mid-battle in Estonia in 1219, with the Danes collapsing, a red banner with a white cross supposedly fell out of the sky and turned the tide. The legend was first written down 300 years later, which tells you it is a legend. But the flag is real, it has flown ever since, and from here on you will see it on the map. Out on the Atlantic edge of the map, the plague's century claimed a stranger victim. Norse Greenland, 400 years old, 2 settlements, churches, even a little cathedral, went silent. The last written record from the colony is a wedding in 1408. After that, nothing. When ships finally returned, they found buildings and no people. The climate had turned, the trade had died, and Europe's furthest outpost starved, sailed home, or vanished into the ice. Historians still argue which. The Vikings' westernmost story has no last page, and then, for one moment, the impossible happened. In 1397, at Kalmar Castle, the 3 crowns became one, and the architect was a woman. Margaret, a Danish king's daughter, outmaneuvered every warlord in the north and built the largest realm in Europe. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under one crown, stretching from Greenland to Finland. Everything the Vikings never managed, welded together by a diplomat. 1 crown, 3 proud kingdoms. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. The Union spent a century tearing at itself, Denmark on top, Sweden straining against it, until a Danish king decided to settle the question with an axe. In November 1520, Christian II took Stockholm, threw a coronation feast, declared an amnesty for his enemies, and then locked the doors. Over 2 days in the Great Square, more than 80 Swedish nobles and churchmen were beheaded. They call it the Stockholm Bloodbath. It was meant to decapitate Swedish resistance. Instead, it created its leader. One young noble, Gustav Vasa, whose father had just died on that scaffold, escaped into the winter forests on skis, heading for Norway with Danish agents behind him. At the village of Mora, he gave up on Sweden entirely. And then, the story goes, the villagers changed their minds, sent their 2 best skiers after him, and caught him 90 kilometers later. That chase is rerun every winter by 16,000 skiers. It is called the Vasaloppet, the world's biggest cross-country ski race, and it exists because 2 men caught one fugitive in 1521. 2 years later, Gustav Vasa was king of an independent Sweden. The 6th of June, 1523. Sweden's national day, still, the Kalmar Union was dead at 126, and the north was now 2 blocks that hated each other. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Keep your eye on the strait between them, because Denmark had turned that strip of water into the greatest cash register in Europe. At the narrowest point of the Sound, under the guns of Kronborg Castle, every ship entering or leaving the Baltic paid Denmark a toll. Every Dutch trader, every English merchant for 400 years. At its peak, it funded around 2/3 of the Danish state. If Kronborg looks familiar, Shakespeare set Hamlet inside it. The castle where something was rotten in the state of Denmark was, in real life, the reason the state of Denmark was rich. Sweden, meanwhile, was building a war machine, and its most famous product failed instantly. In 1628, the royal flagship Vasa, the most expensive object the Swedish state had ever built, sailed 1,300 meters on her maiden voyage and sank in front of the entire cheering capital. Too tall, too narrow, too many cannons. Sweden raised her from the harbour floor 3 centuries later, nearly intact, and today that one embarrassing afternoon is the most visited museum in Scandinavia. The ship sank, the empire did not. Under Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, Sweden stormed into Europe's wars and turned the Baltic into a Swedish lake. The youngest brother of the North, the last one to even become a country, now ruled an empire, and Denmark was about to feel what that meant. In the freezing winter of 1658, a Swedish king did something that should be impossible. Charles X marched his entire army across the frozen sea, ice cracking under cannon wheels, strait by strait, and appeared outside Copenhagen from a direction Denmark did not know could exist. Denmark signed the surrender in Roskilde Cathedral, the church where its kings are buried, and the map you are watching changed more in one signature than in the previous 3 centuries. Skåne, Halland, Blekinge, Bohuslän. The entire eastern third of Denmark gone permanently. Look at the southern tip of modern Sweden. That was Denmark for 600 years. The Sound, Denmark's cash register, now had a Swedish bank on the far shore. The Swedish king then got greedy, turned his army around, and tried to erase Denmark from the map entirely. Copenhagen held. The Dutch, who liked their Baltic trade cheap, sent a fleet through the Sound to break the siege, and in the peace that followed, Denmark clawed back Trondheim and the island of Bornholm. The lesson of 1658 to 1660 stands for the whole century. In the north, the map could change by 1/3 in one winter, and half change back by the next. Empires bought with battles get repossessed the same way. Sweden's turn came deep in Ukraine, at Poltava in 1709, where Russia broke the Swedish army in an afternoon. 9 years later, the warrior king Charles XII was inspecting a siege trench on the Norwegian border when a projectile went through his head, and with him died the empire. Watch the Baltic coastline drain of Swedish colour. The lake was a lake again. Then Europe's biggest war yet arrived, and the North picked wrong. Britain, terrified Napoleon would seize the Danish navy, simply took it first, bombarded Copenhagen for 3 days in 1807, and sailed away with the whole fleet. Denmark, robbed by the British, fell in with Napoleon. Sweden joined the coalition against him, and when Napoleon lost, the bill came due. At Kiel in January 1814, Denmark handed Norway to Sweden like a poker debt. 400 years of Danish rule ended by a treaty Norway was not even invited to, but Denmark kept Norway's old Atlantic islands, Iceland, Greenland, the Faroes. Remember that clause. It is why Greenland speaks Danish today. Norway's answer was the boldest paperwork in this story. Handed from one master to another, the Norwegians gathered at a manor house called Eidsvoll and wrote themselves a constitution, one of the most liberal in Europe, dated the 17th of May, 1814. Sweden invaded anyway, won in 2 weeks, and then did something remarkable. It let Norway keep the constitution inside a shared crown. Norway entered its second union with its own parliament, its own laws, and a national day it still celebrates louder than any other country in Europe celebrates theirs. The 19th century gave Norway its flag, its literature, its shipping fleet, and a bigger and bigger question. Why exactly do we share a king? In 1905, Norway stopped asking and voted, 368,208 votes to leave the Union. 184 against, not one shot fired. Sweden, the empire that once marched armies across frozen seas, shook hands and let Norway go. Norway invited a Danish prince to be King Haakon VII, and the map finally settled into the 3 flags you know. The most feared people in Europe had learned to break up by referendum. The empire's last loose ends tidied themselves the same way. Iceland, holding the world's oldest surviving parliament, voted itself a republic in 1944. And Finland, Swedish for 6 centuries, Russian for 1, independent since 1917, is Nordic but not Scandinavian, and Finns will correct you, so now you can correct everyone else. And in the year 2000, across the exact stretch of water where Denmark taxed the world and Sweden marched across the ice, the 2 old enemies built a bridge and joined their capitals' regions into one commute. The sound that funded wars now carries people to work. So, how did the most feared people in Europe end up the most peaceful? 1,000 years of trying to own each other, an empire drowned at Poltava, a third of Denmark lost in one signature, and a divorce won by 368,000 votes to 184. They fought until there was nothing left to prove, and then they built the bridge. Every single year, the happiness rankings say the same thing. The descendants of the raiders of Lindisfarne now live in the calmest, most contented corner of the planet. Borders are a story we tell. Theirs took 1,000 years, and it ends in the best plot twist on any map. The Vikings won by stopping. If you want to see how an island next door went through the same 1,000 years and came out with a much messier map, the full story of how Ireland was made is on screen now. Subscribe and we will keep drawing the past, one map at a time.